know what? That's right. It's a new. Sorry, guys. You're gonna have to bear with me. We got a new microphone that's got a different setup. I do know how to do it, but you're not the only one.
Turn this one off.
There you go. How's that? All right. Cool. Well, good morning, everybody. Glad to be here this morning. I hope you are too. But if you're not, you're still in the right place. I wanted to start with just a little story about. I got more technical difficulties here. So the first time I ever preached a sermon, it was a really good sermon, and it was a really good sermon because I had. I don't know, like several months' notice, and I probably put like 150 hours worth of work into that first sermon, so it was pretty good. The second sermon I ever preached was horrible. It was a really, really bad sermon. Somehow, I ended up spending like 45 minutes trying to explain the doctrine of the Trinity using like math and about 45 minutes in, my pastor's like, dude, just sit down. You got to end it, right? It was that bad, where like I literally got the hook, right? And now I'm trying to remember. Oh, that's right. I was like, why am I telling this story? The point is this morning's message is going to be really long and boring. No, the point is that this morning's passage is really, I think, what Jesus is talking about in this passage is he's offering a warning for us to be prepared and ready for what it means to follow him in this world, right? And so hopefully that story ties into that a little bit. Not all of you have preached a sermon, but I would imagine that many of you have been in a situation where you had to stand in front of a group of people and address them, right? And that's, like, for some people, they actually have more fear associated with public speaking than they do with death, right? So the point is that what we're being called to as followers of Jesus is something serious. It's something that has real consequence one way or the other. And Jesus is asking us, challenging us, warning us to be ready for that, to be prepared for that, to see that as something that has real consequence, and to walk that out with that, I guess, that sense of gravity in mind. Does that make sense? So we're going to be reading in chapter 12, Luke chapter 12. We've been going through the book of Luke for quite some time now, and we'll be in it for quite a bit longer. And you can turn with me and read along. I'm reading out of the NIV, or you can listen. That's fine too. And we're in chapter 12, verse 49. I've come to bring fire on the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. But I have a baptism to undergo, and what constraint I am under until it is completed. Do you think I came to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, but division. From now on, there will be 5 in one family divided against each other, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. He said to the crowd, when you see a cloud rising in the west, immediately you say, it's going to rain, and it does. And when the south wind blows, you say, it's going to be hot, and it is. Hypocrites. You know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and the sky. How is it that you don't know how to interpret this present time? Why don't you judge for yourselves what is right? As you are going with your adversary to the magistrate, try hard to be reconciled on the way, or your adversary may drag you off to the judge, and the judge turn you over to the officer, and the officer throw you into prison. I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. So this is our passage for this morning, right? Warm, fuzzy words from Jesus. Thank you very much. All right. And Jesus is a strange mix of warm, fuzzy words and words like these, right? Isn't he? And his actions also bear that out, right? There's times when he is just incredibly kind and compassionate and soft and gentle. And then there's also times when he's unyielding and confronting and demanding, right? And I would imagine for all of you, you've experienced God in both of those ways in your life, right? God who is by the presence and power of his Spirit bringing you comfort. He's gentle with you. He's kind towards you. He gives you exactly what you desperately hoped for in exactly the right moment when you were going to be lost without it. But then also there are times when he confronts you with truths that you are desperately trying to avoid hearing, right? And I think that there's some of that that's going on in this passage, right? And just for a little bit of context, right? So this comes in, there's a kind of a long discourse that we're getting from Jesus where he is with his disciples, but also with a crowd of people. So he's been doing a lot of teaching, right? And there's been just kind of like some moral teaching about how to live a good life or a life that honors God. But there's also been a lot of confrontation or challenge that he's been giving to kind of like the religious norms or particularly the religious leaders. And he's been saying, yeah, that's not actually what this is supposed to look like. Let me tell you what it's supposed to look like. Right? And so that's really what's been going on for quite some time now in Luke. And then we come to this passage. And again, Jesus is talking both to his disciples and to the larger crowd. And he's been teaching them about how to avoid the pitfalls of the Pharisees' approach to God and to life, but also a different vision for how to approach God and life. And then again, he offers this challenge, this warning, right? So we're gonna go through kind of like three different chunks of this passage and talk about what he's saying there. But I think just to reiterate, what I see Jesus saying here is, hey, all the stuff that I'm telling you about, they're not just words. This has real consequence. This matters. This is serious. Take it seriously. It's important. Right? I think that's what Jesus is trying to get across. And we'll come back to that again and again, I think, this morning. This may be worth sharing. One of my favorite authors is a guy named Dallas Willard, one of my favorite theological authors. I have some favorite fiction authors too. I'm pretty sure this is in the introduction to The Divine Conspiracy, which is one of his books. He talks about how so often we think that Jesus is, he's about dogma and law. And he says dogma is what you have to believe even though you don't believe it, and law is what you have to do even though you don't want to do it, right? And he says so often we think of Jesus as basically being about dogma and law. But the reality is that nobody who hung out with him saw him that way. Nobody who interacted with him saw him that way at all. Instead, the people who were walking around with Jesus, they saw him as the source of a powerful life full of wisdom and love. Right? So his disciples saw him as the source of the best wisdom on how to live the best kind of life possible. So not dogma, something you have to believe because you're supposed to, but you don't really believe it, or law, things you're supposed to pretend to follow because everybody tells you you're gonna have to do this, but you don't really want to do it and you don't really do it full-heartedly. No. This is like the best wisdom possible from the truest, most beautiful source in the universe, right? That's who Jesus is. And so I think that, again, like there's something in this passage that Jesus is pointing at. He's essentially saying, hey, like this isn't just stuff we're supposed to pretend to believe or stuff we're supposed to pretend to care about. This is actually like life hinges on this. What truly matters hinges on this. So the next slide, Jesus says, I came to bring division. Right? Does that work? I came to bring division. Why? Right? Why would Jesus come to bring division? And he even says, you think I'm bringing peace? I'm not bringing peace. And again, there's other places where Jesus is called the Prince of Peace, right? So is it that peace is bad and that's why Jesus came to bring division? I don't think so, right? Ultimately, where the story ends, it ends in a place of peace, right? But So it's not that peace is bad. It's not even that division is good, but it's that, so one of the things that we learned as parents of more than one child is that oftentimes the peace that exists in the home is the function of like parental threats, right? It's like, you will get along, you will not fight, or else there will be consequences, right? And so in one way, that's a kind of peace, but you wouldn't describe a brother and a brother who are not fighting with each other, even though they hate each other desperately and miserably, but they're even more afraid of their father. Like, I don't know if I would describe that as a peaceful home, right? And so if there's conflict there, but it's not out in the open, if there's like antagonism or even just like coldness between brothers, but it's not out in the open, then actually maybe what really needs to happen is a little bit of conflict. Maybe it needs to be brought out into the open and dealt with. So you can imagine two children that are peacefully coexisting, and you set a slice of cake in between them and find out like how much they love each other, right? Which, I mean, you don't have to run this experiment on purpose. If you're a parent, this experiment happens naturally all the time, right? And then you get to see how generous your kids are towards each other, how much they value each other's pleasure over their own, right? And this is for those of you guys with like really little kids. This is a freebie. I'll throw it out there, free parenting advice. I don't remember where we heard it, but we learned it from somebody else, right? Okay, there's one slice of cake and there's two kids. You get the knife and you get to choose, right? So it's like the Solomon version of cake splitting, right? So one person gets to split the cake and the other person gets to choose. And I don't think I've ever seen my children be more mathematically precise in exactly getting the cake split right down the middle as when we started implementing that policy. And it really worked, right? It took away the fight. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily translate into two kids who actually love each other, although I think my kids do love each other. But again, I think what Jesus is saying here is not that division is good or peace is bad, but that there actually exists in this world a conflict, and it actually needs to be brought out into the open, right? And people have to actually make a decision about how they're going to respond to this conflict. And I think the conflict that almost always is being talked about is, are people going to be people who are genuinely offering God their lives or not, right? Are we going to be people who step into the light of God's kingdom and follow Jesus or not? And that's a real decision that has real consequences. And Jesus is saying, yeah, that's going to cause division because there are places where people are choosing to serve other gods or to follow other paths. And to choose to follow the path of Jesus will have consequences in the relationships that people have with each other, even inside of families. That make sense? So the next slide. So Jesus uses this metaphor of from farming, right? I remember the first time I went and stayed at my in-laws' place. This was before they were my in-laws, right? So Tammy and I I think we'd been dating for like 6 months and figured we were pretty serious, and it was time for me to meet her family. So I'm from California, Tammy's from New York. We met in the University of Wyoming in the middle. So I hopped on a bus and came out to Bath, New York, small little farming town, and got to meet her family. And one of the interesting things about what my father-in-law, his kind of routine is, every night he would spend an hour watching. This is back before the internet. He would spend an hour watching the Weather Channel, right? And it just kind of clicked for me. Oh, that's right. He actually has to watch the Weather Channel because he needs to know what he's going to go do tomorrow as a farmer. And I grew up in a pretty rural area. I'd even worked on some farms, but for some reason that never clicked. That, oh, wow, like if you're a farmer, you really got to pay close attention to the weather. You got to know what's coming, right? And Jesus is saying that. Like, you guys, this is, is a much more agrarian society in Jesus' day than ours is. They to the west was a giant source of rain, and you notice when clouds come from the west that rain is about to follow. There's a big desert to the south. Oh, when the wind is blowing from the south, it's going to be hot, right? You guys get that, he's saying. And then he calls them hypocrites. Why does he call them hypocrites? I had to kind of wrestle with this when I was looking at this passage. He calls them hypocrites because they can read the weather patterns, but they can't read the sign of the times. Why would he call them hypocrites? And I think this is what I came up with. This is my answer. So first of all, the word hypocrite is a word that, to the best of our ability to understand, Jesus is the first one that we know about to use the word hypocrite the way he uses the word hypocrite, right? The word hypocrite is a word, it's a Greek word that refers to an actor on a stage. Like if you guys have ever seen the kind of like ancient Greek tragedies or comedies where they wore these giant masks that were painted with kind of like elaborate paintings to kind of like demonstrate like who the figure was, right? Who the character was. And those actors were called hypocrites, right? And so you can immediately see like why Jesus would use that as a metaphor, right? It makes a lot of sense. Oh, you're wearing this giant painted mask on your face to pretend to be somebody that you're not. Yeah, that'll preach, right? And so Jesus uses that term, and again, maybe there were other people who had used it before him, and he grabbed that, or maybe he was the first one to use that as this metaphor. But that's what he's doing, right? It's this. He's saying you're playing, you're acting, you're playing a role when he calls people hypocrites, and so he is talking to people, and what he is essentially saying is, you're more attentive to what's going on in your farming life than you are in your relationship with God. You're more attentive to what's going on in, your business dealings than you are in your relationship to the things that you claim actually are more important. You're playing. It's just a game. Does that make sense? So that's what Jesus is pointing at, and he's saying you should be able to see what is going on. If you were paying attention at all, you should be able to see what's going on. And we're going to come back to this. But I think what Jesus is pointing at, clearly, is his life and his ministry and the circumstances that surround it, the things that are going on in the Jewish nation, in the Jewish faith, in the relationship to the Roman Empire that has occupied the Jewish people, the Jewish nation for a few generations at this point. And he's saying, no. If you were paying attention, you would see that God is up to something. Just like you're paying attention to the horizon and rain is coming. If you were paying attention at all to what's going on, you would understand what is about to happen, right? So next slide. Oh yeah, this is how many of you guys have seen this? It's a Netflix miniseries. What's it called? You Don't Know Me is the title of it, which I don't know. I liked it, so a little plug if you want to watch it. It's kind of like a mystery courtroom drama miniseries. I've decided I won't watch TV shows. I'll only watch miniseries because, I can't watch a story that doesn't have an ending. It really bugs me, so I've sworn off television shows or anything that doesn't have an ending. Anyway, but Jesus. Sorry, little personal information. It was Lost. How many of you guys watched Lost? Yeah, it ruined. It was the pilot of Lost. I was like, this is what I've been waiting for my whole life. And then they did that every episode for however many, like 5 seasons. And then, it's just all a dream. And I wanted to have a fight with anybody that had anything to do with making that show. Anyway, sorry. So now I won't watch anything that I know they haven't written the ending before they start it. I got to know that you actually thought through the end of this story before I'll read it or watch it. Anyway, the guy in this picture he's a defendant, right? And Jesus is saying to the people, right, if you know that you're about to go stand before a judge who pretty much has the power of life and death over you, you might want to figure some things out before you show up, right? And I don't know how many of you guys have ever had to stand before a judge, even just for a traffic ticket or something like that. It's not a fun experience, right? It's not something you enjoy. I mean, I think the last time I went before a judge was the town of Tonawanda traffic court, and everybody that went up before me had their tickets reduced to a parking ticket, and I had already talked to the county prosecutor, and he said that was what was going to happen, and I still was like scared. Like I know that I'm going to have this speeding ticket reduced to a traffic or to a parking ticket, but I'm still kind of like a little skittish about what's about to happen, right? But Jesus is saying, yeah, like if you're going to walk into a court, you might want to actually deal with the consequences on the front end instead of just let whatever horrible thing is going to happen to you, right? So he's essentially saying, handle your business, right? Deal with your life. Deal with the fact that this judgment is coming. And I mean, I don't know, as Christians, we have an interesting relationship to judgment, right? There are churches or Christians who really love to thump their Bible on the pulpit and talk about judgment, and then we're probably a church that doesn't necessarily like to talk about judgment as much, right? But I think the reality is, and Jesus is saying it here, is judgment is coming. It really is, and he's using a courtroom metaphor here. And, I mean, that kind of begs the question. I know, the question it begs is God capricious? Like, does God want to judge us simply because he can and is making up rules along the way so that he can kind of trick us and trap us? And, like, is that who God is? Because sometimes we think of God that way. Right? And again, if we think of Jesus as Dallas Willard says, if we think of our faith in terms of dogma and law, the stuff that we're supposed to believe and the stuff that we have to do, even though it doesn't make any sense to us, then we'll end up seeing God as a God who is just making up rules to trip us up. But if we see God as actually the source of all beauty and the source of all meaning and the source of all wisdom, then we actually won't see his judgment that way. Right? That's not how we'll see his judgment at all. Instead, we'll think, oh, like God's judgments are righteous and true. And where I find myself on the wrong side of God's judgment, I should actually side with him and not myself. Right? In many ways, to be a disciple is to sign up for a lifetime of judgment in some ways. Right? That's kind of what that is. I was trying to think of a story to tell from my own life just to kind of highlight some of this. And I don't know how big of an event it was, but it's a moment in my spiritual formation that even when I was thinking about it this morning, I still have like a little bit of shame attached to it, right? So I was on the staff of the church in Reading, and this was when the internet was still kind of like a new thing, right? And you guys remember blogs? And they had comment sections, right? So this was all new, right? And one of the guys on staff at our church had a blog, and I was starting to kind of like poke at him in his comment section about some theological stuff. Only I was doing it anonymously, right? Which, yeah, right, exactly. But again, I didn't know that was probably something not to do at the time because this is all like a new experience, right? And he was my friend, and I was kind of having fun with him. Anyway, so he and I had this, I don't know, probably a week or two long back and forth conversation on his blog. I was anonymous. And I happened to be at a meeting with our staff, and my pastor, Pastor Mike, he asked me, hey, have you read that conversation on Levi's blog? I'm like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. Just rolled right, the lie just came right out, right? And again, I immediately was like, oh, I can't believe I just lied to my pastor, right? And I didn't say anything. And I went home, and I don't remember how many days it took, but I'm like, my conscience was gnawing at me. So, and again, I think it would have even been better if it was a more important lie. It was like so stupid of a lie, you know what I mean? So again, I had to call him up, Pastor Mike, I got to talk to you about something. And I told him I had to confess something to him, and then when I told him what it was, I'm pretty sure he laughed in my face. You're a moron, you know what I mean? Like, can't you have some more real things to confess? Anyway, but it was yeah, it was like, I think even more than the fact that I had told a lie, it was like how natural it came off my tongue that really, in many ways, is a part of the problem in that story, right? The problem in my character. And, James says, consider it all joy, my brothers, when you encounter trials of many kinds. I didn't see that as something that I thought was an opportunity for joy, but it actually was an opportunity for me to be exposed, right? For who I thought I was to be brought into contrast with who I actually was. Right? I thought I was an honest person. I actually wasn't as honest of a person as I thought I was, and that trial showed that, and that's exactly what James says. He says, consider it joy when you face trials of many kinds. Why? Because it produces a change in your character when those things happen to you, right? It actually changes who you are, and we should desire that. And so again, discipleship really is, it's instead of being afraid of judgment and running away from it and seeing it as something that's going to come someday in the future, it's us saying, hey, God, like, judge me now. Like, help, and then help me to become the kind of person who actually can not just mentally agree to your judgments, but actually live out the righteousness that you're calling me to. That's what I want to be, right? That's who I want to be. And so that's this, I think in many ways, this call that Jesus is pointing at in this passage. Right? He's saying, no, this is serious. This matters. Take it seriously. Do your business with God. All right, next slide. I love that picture. It captures so much, right? So I started off with a story about, my first sermon and my second sermon. Yeah, like this, you don't end up there by accident, right? You don't end up, and again, I don't know how many of you guys have done something like that, read some of your poetry or sang a song in, a talent show or whatever it is, but like that's not something that you do by accident. And while I would imagine many people the first time doing that or many times doing that, there is still fear and trepidation attached to that. I don't usually get afraid preaching, but every now and then I will. It happens. But the point is that there's a real choice that is involved in ending up in a place like that. And, you don't, as much as you don't end up there by accident. Okay, so Jesus in many ways is saying like, hey, make a decision and take it seriously. And I was thinking about, all right, well, so how does that apply to us, right? Because in some ways, I'm just trying to tell you, like, hey, make a decision to follow Jesus and take it seriously. But I also recognize that I'm talking to a room full of people who've made a decision to follow Jesus and are kind of taking it seriously, right? But so were plenty of the people in Jesus' audience too, right? So there were, like, he had a group of disciples who had forsaken everything to follow him. And so in one sense, Jesus is calling people to do something that they've kind of already sort of done. But here's where I think this really, again, gets practical, is you can make a decision to climb a mountain, and halfway up, you can decide you don't want to climb the mountain. You can make a decision to marry a woman, and 10 years in, decide you don't want to be married to that woman. You can make a decision to have a child and just decide, as this is a lot of work, right? These are things that require an initial decision to enter into, but then they require a lifetime of decisions to carry out. I remember the first time I climbed a mountain in a long time, and I'm going to actually acknowledge that it was a real mountain. I usually give Matt a hard time about the Adirondack peaks and say, no, those aren't real mountains. Only in California do you have real mountains. But it was a real mountain, and I mean, I don't think I'd climbed a mountain in 10, 15 years, and Matt, he's like, hey, so what do you think about going on vacation? Sure, okay, let's do a day's worth of hard work. Not my idea of vacation, but Matt's my friend, so we went. Anyway, but so climbing this mountain, out of shape, 42-year-old body, or however old I was, and man, like it was, I think the only thing that got me to the top was the fact that my two kids were in front of me and I didn't want to be embarrassed, right? I did not want to climb that mountain about halfway up, especially when it started getting steep. I was ready to quit. But so the point is, right, is that while, yeah, we're in this room, the vast majority of you, I would imagine you're in this room because you made a decision to follow Jesus, but it's like making a decision to climb a mountain and driving and getting out of your car and looking at the mountain. That's just the beginning, right? And then there's the climb and the persistence. And so I think that's why Jesus is saying these words, and I think why they still matter to people like us who have said, yeah, I want to follow Jesus with my life, and I know that it matters. Okay, but that decision, every step up the mountain requires a decision of the will to continue up the mountain, and Jesus is reminding us of that. All right, last slide here. So I knew I was going to use a sports metaphor, so I also had to use some like other metaphors first, just to like, again, this is my promise to myself and to you guys is to not only use sports metaphors. This guy is named Bo Nickel. Anybody know who Bo Nickel is? Am I the only one? Okay. He used to be a wrestler. Now he's an MMA fighter. And how do you know he's a wrestler? His ears, right? How many of you guys were like, what the heck is going on with those ears, right? So that's why I put this up there, is because of the ears. So you guys may or may not have noticed I have a little bit of cauliflower ear, right? Mine isn't really that bad. Sometimes people notice it, sometimes people don't, because I don't have a lot of it. In the wrestling community, or the jiu-jitsu community, or the MMA community, they're kind of like, it's kind of like a badge, right? Those are like really amazing cauliflower ears. I had a roommate in college. He was same year as me. No, that's right. He was a freshman, but it was my first year at Wyoming. So we were roommates at Wyoming. And he kind of a freak accident. He broke his neck. He ended up, he was paralyzed for a couple of days, but then recovered. So real freak thing. But they told him, you're done. You can't wrestle anymore. Well, he had not gotten cauliflower ear yet. So he would, he was always trying to get us to give him cauliflower ear. He's like trying to get us to hit him in the ear with things. And because he just wanted to have cauliflower ear so bad. Oh, Dan Tyson. Anyway, one of my roommates. So again, it's kind of like this, it's a little bit of a badge in the sport of wrestling. So what it is your ears are made out of cartilage, and if the cartilage breaks, it fills with fluid, which is really painful, but then the fluid will harden if you don't drain it, and if you keep doing that over and over and over again, they'll end up looking like that, right? So he's got these big hard lumps on the side of his head that they feel almost like bone, but it's called cauliflower ear. And what that is that's evidence of somebody who has been using their head as a weapon against another human being for like 20 years. That's what that is, right? So it's like, it's a sign of a lifestyle, right? It's a symbol of something that somebody has been doing. And again, you don't get that without a tremendous amount of sacrifice and discipline and pain that you've just continued to sign up for day in and day out for, he's probably 26, 27 years old, was one of the best wrestlers in the world, and then has made the transition into, he's now in the UFC fighting. But again, like really disciplined person. And so I think if we're going to ask that question, what does it look like for us to take Jesus's call to follow him seriously, to say, okay, this matters, right? And again, you don't end up on stage with a microphone in front of you by accident. You don't end up in a UFC cage by accident either, right? That doesn't happen by accident. But also, I've never fought, but I wrestled, and I do know what that experience is like. And I have had to walk out onto, a mat against another opponent in front of 10,000 people and didn't know who was going to win, but we're going to find out, right? Like I've had that experience. And again, you don't do that by accident. And I think Jesus is saying the same thing about our lives as people who are following him. This isn't something that just happens by accident, right? What happens by accident is I tell a lie to my pastor. That's what happens by accident, right? What happens on purpose is I go back and I repent and I confess and ask forgiveness. That's what happens on purpose. And then a decade or 2 decades of training like that is what leads to, in a difficult situation where you want to tell a lie to get out of it, you tell the truth, right? That's how that works. And that's what Jesus is calling us to, is a life of serious devotion and training, not in how to wrestle or fight physically, but in how to actually live out the truths of the kingdom in our lives. How to love people, how to forgive people, how to ask for forgiveness, how to point people towards God with our lives and with our words, how to honor God with our singing and to be intimate with him in quiet moments, how to rely on God when we're overwhelmed or scared, how to be honest, how to love a woman for your whole life instead of 10 years, how to, deal with fighting children or what, like all of these things are things that God wants us to be able to do, right? And so I think it kind of begs the question then, well, what is it like? What is a life of training? What are the spiritual cauliflower ears that God wants us to have, right? Like, I hope that image sticks with you, right? That what are the things that we look at? Again, if you see a guy like that on the street, don't pick a fight with him, right? So kind of, I hope I saved somebody's life today, right? Yeah, so what are the things that, did you have something to say? Oh, I thought I heard something. Yeah, you got something to say, yeah.
So the whole, discerning the signs of the times thing, I feel like I've heard that used by Christians of lots of different types to suggest that part of discipleship is some sort of cultural discernment. Like we're supposed to be able to see what's really happening in the world. That might be, is it the end times? There's wars and earthquakes and blah, blah, blah. Or it could be like, this is America's racial reckoning or whatever. And I've always found this really confusing, and I can't tell if that's what Jesus is saying. You should be able to see what God is doing in the world right now through the lens of discipleship. Yeah. Or if that's just us trying to do God's job. And really he's just saying, in that moment, you should be able to see that I am the way to the people immediately around you.
Yeah.
So I don't know if this is making sense, but what's that? Is that a call to, if you're following Jesus, you're going to be able to see what God is doing in the world? Or is that just an abuse of the text?
I probably would lean in the direction of both and for that question. I think it is. So first of all, just how we're supposed to read Scripture is to engage with Scripture by understanding what was going on then and there, and then to pull some application out for here and now, right? Because this is, first of all, this isn't the Bible in its original language, right? It wasn't written in English. It was written in several different languages, but the chunk that we're reading was written in Greek and was written 2,000 years ago, right? In a different language, different culture, different context. And so, we do have to understand that. And I think Jesus is specifically talking about, as best as I can understand this passage, he's talking about his ministry, right? He's not saying to all Christians everywhere, you should be able to understand when the end times are coming, or you should be able to understand the politics of your day. He is saying specifically to the people around him, hey, the things that we have all as a nation of people who are in covenant relationship to the Creator God, the things that we have been talking about and praying about and singing about and dreaming about for as long as we've been a people are happening right now. Are you paying attention? That's what Jesus is really saying, right? And, what's coming is, and it should be obvious that this is what's coming because, we're halfway through the Gospel of Luke. Jesus has done a lot of things already. He's gathered a group of disciples. He has preached a lot of messages. He has performed a lot of miracles. He's also had a lot of confrontations, right? And so it's kind of like, well, are you paying attention to where this is all going? He's even told his disciples what's coming, right? He's told them about the crucifixion. So I think that's really what's going on in this text is that, right? No, so then when you step back and you're like, well, so should we as Christians be able to kind of discern what's going on around us? Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think that, and I think that that is a lesson we could draw from this passage, is that we should be people who are aware of where God is at work in our world. But I also think that oftentimes that isn't done with real, honestly, I just want to say with real honesty. I think that oftentimes the way the church will, it's more about kind of like political gamesmanship than it is a real genuine desire to understand where God is at work in our world or in our culture, in our country. Yeah. Yes.
And to your right, it says that last passage about the magistrate is a metaphor for the Jews and the authorities. You talked about the piece of cake that's being divided up is Israel between the Romans and the Jews, right?
Yeah.
So the fight that they've been having over this, right? And Jesus is saying, you better get right with the authorities that are here, or this judgment is coming, the 70 AD
Right.
judgment that the Romans brought on the Jewish people and the temple. And so Jesus is saying, in my ministry, there's this reckoning coming, right? This confrontation coming. But in your lives, there's this confrontation coming. The point for the judgment, though, I feel, is supposed to be, in the church, I think a lot of times we point that judgment towards the other party. And I think Jesus is intended for that judgment to be pointed.
Yeah.
He's saying, you get, like you said, you have to focus on what you did. You get that right with the judge before you go into court. And Jesus is telling them, there's this, if you don't get right with the Romans, there's this reckoning that's coming. And so you need to, it's us, we need to get right together, the church, So.
I think you said that more succinctly and articulately and powerfully than I did, but that idea that I think the way that oftentimes the church is engaging around trying to judge the times or discern the times, I think that is what I was trying to point out when I said it's not exactly always honest, is that if we want to understand what God is doing, that starts with us figuring out how to be God's faithful people, not, God, how can I use your Bible to make my neighbor do what I want him to do, right? That's probably not the kind of judgment that God is wanting to bring on our world or on the church. So, yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, David.
I think that the sign of the times is Jesus wants the culture around him, the people around him, to see him and what he's come for. And it's a battle of God's will versus our will.
Yeah.
And they didn't see that they were fighting God when they were fighting Jesus.
Yeah.
We don't see we're fighting God when we just make decisions all
Yeah.
the time.
Yes.
And the signs of time for us is, God, your will, not my will.
Yes.
And that's what we have to pay attention to, is that God's got a will that's much better than our will
Yes.
out there, and we need to be succinct with it, and that's the sign of the times. Are you succinct with the will of God?
Yes. Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly. And I think that's where, the place that I would like this to be practical and applicable for us this morning is, and back to the cauliflower ears question, right? Is like, what does it look like for us to be people who are really seriously taking that call to discipleship as kind of like the central project of our lives, right? That I want to do that work of saying to God, you tell me what your will is and help me understand where my will is not in alignment with your will. And then I don't just want to know this as an intellectual exercise. Help me to live it out. Help me to be somebody that lives out your will in every area of my life, right? And so, again, like what does that look like in our day-to-day lives? What would it look like instead of for somebody to say, look at Gail, look at that cauliflower she's got. Make sure you don't fight with Gail, right? But instead to say, look at this about Gail. You can tell she's one of those Jesus people because of this aspect of her life, this aspect of even her body maybe, right? Wouldn't that be cool if you were like, oh, you can tell who the Christians are because they walk like this, or they look like that, or they act like this, or they speak like that. And I mean, that's a question for us to wrestle with, yeah.
I can't help but wonder if the scary thing about all of what's been said in regard to hypocrisy
Yes.
And then when our actual character is being questioned or demonstrated, they see hypocrisy. And maybe that's part of the reason why there's something missing.
Yes.
And there's a judgment coming, as Matt said, first to us.
Yes.
Instead of projecting it onto other people, onto the world, all the things that they're doing, it needs to start at home.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, this passage, if it's anything, it's a call to take off the mask, right? And to not be people who are playing games with our faith. And, you know, I think the training to go get into a cage fight involves, you know, like cardio work and lifting weights and training and striking and grappling and all of these kinds of things. The training to live a life that matters for the kingdom obviously is not about those things. It's about things like, you know, learning to relate to each other in loving ways, like learning how to, you know, I don't know if you guys know this or not, but you're all people, and that makes you hard to love, right? And so it's like, all right, how do we do that well? How do we love each other well? How do we, you know, take care of each other and deal with the difficulty that comes with actually letting another human being into your life and trusting them, right? That's hard, but it's also, that's a part of the training. That's a part of what we're called to, right? Another part of it is that we're people who actually are trying to be a force for good in the world, right? We're loving our neighbors. We're sharing our faith with them. We're also trying to fix problems in our, again, you know, big or small, whatever it is, but like all of us are called to do something with our lives that are a part of like demonstrating and proclaiming the gospel to our neighbors. And then ultimately, the single largest thing that we're called to is not just loving each other or loving our neighbors, but being in a relationship with God himself, where we're, you know, that's the training that we're called to, or the lifestyle that we're called to, is to be people of prayer, people of the book, people of worship, people who are encountering the Spirit of God with our lives as a way of life. And that's something that we value, not because we're supposed to, because that's the kind of mask that we wear, but because we actually think it really matters for who we are and for our world, right? So we're gonna transition to take communion, but again, communion. This is, you know, this is a ritual meal that Christians have participated in since as long as there have been Christians, and there's a ton of symbolism wrapped up in that. It means a lot of different things, but the central kind of symbolism of this meal is that we would be people who are choosing Jesus with our lives because he is the person who has chosen us with his life, right? This is this like physical enactment of the gospel that as his people we engage in. That's what this is, right? And so, you know, if you're in the room and you're like, well, I don't know if I want to follow Jesus, you don't have to come take communion, right? Just because most of the other people in the room are doing that, that's fine. It's not for everybody. It's for people who want to follow Jesus. But also, if you've got all sorts of reasons for why you're a miserable person, but you want to follow Jesus, then this is for you, right? This is for miserable people who want to follow Jesus. For big fat sinners who tell lies when they're not supposed to, or fight with their wives, or whatever. Like, that's who this is for, right? This is for people who are saying, I want to choose Jesus with my life because he's chosen me with his life. Make sense? Yeah, you can come up, Jay. And then, so I'm just going to invite you guys to come up. We've got bread and juice, and then the gluten-free option is the little prepackaged cups. But come up and grab the elements and return to your seats, and then I'll lead us in communion together. So come on up. So Jesus gathered his friends for a meal, not a symbolic or ritual meal like this one, but an actual meal. But it was also a symbolic and a ritual meal. Just involved a lot more food and a lot more drink, a lot more time spent eating. And when he did that, he knew what was coming, right? He knew that this was the last time he was going to be able to hang out with his friends before he went to the cross. And so he took the bread on the table and he blessed it, thanked God for it, and broke it and offered it to his friends. And he said, "This is my body broken for you. Remember my death when you eat it." And he also took the wine. And in the same way, he said to his friends, "This is my blood. It's the blood of the new covenant." From Paul's letter to the Colossians, he writes, "God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held in the gospel. This is the gospel that you have heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant." The meal that we just shared together is a declaration of our intention to follow Jesus with our lives, but it's also a declaration of exactly what Paul is proclaiming in this passage, right? That you have been washed and reconciled and made right with God, right? That you are firm and free in the hope of the promise of God in and through Jesus, right? That this is our declaration, but it's also his declaration to us. So again, God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, in Jesus, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant." Why don't we stand? So, if God is stirring something up in you this morning, maybe in the words of Paul, you struggle. He says that we can be enemies of God in our minds. Again, not that God sees us as his enemy, but that we see God as our enemy, right? And maybe that's something you struggle with or you wrestle with. Maybe the word that was shared this morning, or a time of worship, or something from the passage, God is just doing something with you this morning. Don't leave without responding to that, right? You can turn to the person you came in with and ask them to pray for you. You can come talk to me or one of the other leaders, but respond to whatever work the Spirit is doing in you this morning, okay? That's my admonition. Here's my blessing. I pray that you would receive the good news, God's great reconciliation, that you would recognize that because of the work that he has done, you are holy and free from blemish in his sight, and that you would go out and live lives of joy and purpose and peace. And I pray that in his name. Amen.